Hello everybody and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and this is going to be our first broad lecture, our first topic lecture in our world history course. Um, I divided the course into six broad topics. The first is early civilizations, and with early civilization, we will cover primarily the rise of states in the Nile River Valley, the rise of China, the organization of the first three dynasties in China. We will cover India in the Vedic age, and of course the Indus Valley civilization. And we will look at the beginnings of civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean. That is along the shores of the Eastern Mediterranean. We'll look at groups such as the Hittites, the Babylonians, and of course the Sumerians and the Akkadians, who we will rightly begin with. Now, in the last lecture, in the last video, we looked at we looked at the broad overview of the course with my course introduction, and in the I guess we can say the companion video for that, I sort of outlined the class government scheme. It's a class management scheme that I use for when I work with groups and with kids. I pretty much intended it. I began it to basically just help me control the class, to sort of bind them into following class rules and in class patterns of behavior by making it by basically basing class rules and behaviors off of off of a class constitution, off of a document that they helped create, to sort of bind their interest into it, so that it's not just the instructor imposing his will on the class, but it's a document that the instructor approves, but was drafted and largely created by the students themselves, and that can be added to by the students themselves. And so, with that said, I'd like to dive right into our lectures. And let me just begin by saying that these lectures will not delve deeply into the civilizations that we cover. They will serve as an introductory, these lectures will serve as an introduction or a primer on these states. The civilizations that we will cover in this course are remote in the minds of most people. They act as they act as the cultural basis for many of these civilizations and for many of the cultural and civic institutions that emerged later that we enjoy today. These civilizations also dictate our understanding of what a civilization should look like. That is urban based, engaging in long distance and regional trade, literate, practicing agriculture and animal husbandry. The aim of this course is to provide an introductory level awareness of these states and cultures that flourished through history, and to really help to create a better understanding of our modern society. Now, the cradles of early civilization that we will look at are situated in the great river systems of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which traverse through Iraq, modern day Iraq. They rise in the Zagros Mountains, and they flow into the Persian Gulf. The Nile River, which flows in from the Ethiopian highlands in East Africa, joining at modern day Khartoum, flowing into the Mediterranean. The Indus River, the cradle of Indian civilization, a civilization that we still that we still do not know that much about. It was largely unknown to the world until the 1920s, when it was discovered really by chance, by accident. And of course, we're going to look at the Yellow River. And the Yellow River really serves as the nexus of Chinese civilization. Now, the first literate urban-based civilizations to emerge was ancient Sumer, and that would be ancient Sumer, the region would be the extreme southern sections of Mesopotamia. That is the extreme southern sections of modern day Iraq, And back in antiquity, these cities were coastal cities. They were very much on the shores of the Persian Gulf, but they're very much inland now due to the silting of the rivers during antiquity. Now, the creation of the civilizations in Sumer rested on the achievements of the peoples of the Neolithic age, and the Neolithic simply means new Stone Age. A lot of times, classes are thrown off by terms such as Paleolithic or Mesolithic or Neolithic, and they simply mean Old Stone Age. Paleo means old, and lithos means stone. So Paleolithic is the Old Stone Age. Meso is middle. So Mesolithic is simply Middle Stone Age, and Neolithic, neo means new, and so Neolithic is simply the New Stone Age. And these stages refer to the developments in human the stages of development of humanity when humans got really good at making stone tools. They became experts at flaking flint and obsidian, and really began to take these stones and manufacture great tools and weapons. Now, between 11,000 and 6,000 BCE, they also began to domesticate plants and animals, which were the first two steps in developing settled communities. Settled communities, which eventually led to the first cities and the first literate civilizations. Now, it is believed that in Eastern Asia Minor, what is now modern-day Turkey, various nuts and legumes and the pig were domesticated. In the Levantine region of the Eastern Mediterranean and what is now modern-day Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria, humans began to domesticate cattle, goats, barley, and wheat. Later, these two zones came into contact with one another, and they began to swap those resources in one of the first great cultural exchanges of peoples. And by 6000 BCE, across the ancient Near East, which was comprised of the Levant, the eastern shores of the Mediterranean, Asia Minor, and of course Mesopotamia, Neolithic villages began to emerge. These villages were homes to hundreds of peoples, but it was believed that they did not grow into numbering in the thousands. Now, these were sophisticated sites with mud brick huts or homes, and with wood or stone buildings. Now, the settling down of the populations, together with the shift from hunting and gathering in favor of crop and stock raising. Stock raising is animal husbandry, is raising animals. Helped to make dense populations possible, and also led to skill speciality. That is, you're no longer a hunter or a gatherer, but you're making let's say you developed a technique to make really good clothing, or you develop really good techniques for making stone weapons. Those sort of specializations come into play at this point. Now, because these villages had the ability to stockpile food, they could have persons who otherwise would be needed for food production and food harvesting. Those people now had the ability to devote their time and their energy to other pursuits. Now, this is the rise or the beginning of complex societies. These early villages will go on to have major breakthroughs in ceramics. Ceramics are very important because the storage jars, the containers, were necessary for the long-term keeping of grain. They also found out that they can keep dried fruit in these ceramic vessels. They fermented drinks, fruit juices and so forth. They fermented those into early wines, and they also made like early beer in these ceramic vessels. And they also began to store oils in these vessels. Ceramics also help to keep vermin away from the foodstuff, so you can keep pests, you can keep the rats out, you can keep the bugs out of your foodstuff, you can keep them away from them because of these ceramics. Now, once the technology for crafting ceramics and working clay had been developed, metals are really not that far behind. And really, you need a kiln to sort of create the ceramic vessels, and it's not that far of a leap to jump from a ceramic kiln to a metalworking forge. Once you develop the technology, once you develop the pattern for keeping the fire burning and for raising the temperature of the fire, you can make that leap. You already have developed the working the workings for that for those stuff, so you can go on to work in gold and silver and copper before moving on to bronze, which was first melted from copper and tin around 3500 BCE. Now, impressive Neolithic villages that remain to us include well-known sites such as Jericho. And at Jericho, we see evidence of continual occupation stretching back to 6000 BCE. And at Jericho, we see increasing sophistication in masonry, specialization of labor, and the evolution of stock animals and plants. Now, another important Neolithic site is Ktal Hayuk on the Konya Plains in Asia Minor. Now, Ktal Hayuk is known for its wall depictions in an area called the Bull Room, a room containing the heads of sacrificed bulls and figurines of gods, showing the sophistication and evolution of the thought process of these early peoples between the years 6000 and 4500 BCE. It is important to note that these early population centers are not located in the river valley systems. They are located in areas where the soils can be easily worked or where the lands are very fertile. Now, these villages were in regions where the stone, where the easily made, the easily flaked stone hand tools could easily just scratch the surface of the ground and plant crops. The technology and the environmental conditions place artificial limitations on the size of these villages. We refer to them as villages as not true cities. They never really numbered into the thousands. They were limited to the hundreds. We have to note that the people were not capable of evolving those Neolithic villages, even though they are impressive. They were not capable of evolving them into true cities. We also do not have any real records, any written records, because this is the time in which all of humanity was illiterate. We do not have any written records from the contemporary sites that indicates any sort of intensive agriculture across the globe. We don't have any sort of records in the Nile River Valley for that, and agriculture will arrive later in the Nile River Valley. It would only come into real prominence towards the very end of this period. Now, the pressures for more land, technological improvements, and the great stresses of society led to an important change documented around 4500 BCE. And at this time, we are going to use physical records to observe this change. We do not have writing yet. We do not have we do not know really who the people are, but we have an idea on who they will become. There is a shift in settlement into the river valleys, specifically into ancient Sumer, into the southern extremes of modern day Iraq. There were several breakthroughs that allowed this. One was the development of a more sophisticated plow, the domestication of oxen to pull those plows. Those were the two major breakthroughs. By 3500 BCE, they had crafted impressive plows pulled by teams of 2 to 8 oxen. The population that moves into this area begins to clear the dense undergrowth along the rivers, inaugurating a period of intense agriculture in the river valley system. Large settlements with more dense populations begin to arise. This period is known as the Al-Ubaid period, named after the Arabic town where one of the first cities were excavated. From this moment on, we can really trace with hard evidence the major technological innovations in Mesopotamia that led to the development of true cities, and really our first civilization that we'll discover, that we will discuss, I should say, by the year 3000 BCE. Now, there are a number of preconditions that had to be met before this. Namely, the Tigris or the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers were not easy rivers to tame. Once the early peoples decided to move into the river valleys, they had to abandon hunting, fishing, gathering, the real hallmarks of human existence, of human existence for much of humanity's history. They had to abandon those. They had to drain the marshes. They had to channel the river systems into irrigated fields, and this took a long time to do. And it was accompanied by various degrees of social experimentation and organization. The Euphrates is a meandering, slow, and sluggish river. It is not ideal for communication and has a number of tributaries. And the Euphrates have been known to change its course. That is to change where it is flowing frequently. And what we see in Mesopotamia is man trying to make a distinction between land and water where nature does not. Man is trying to cordon off where the land will be and where the river will not be. And the river does not abide by those rules. The river does not acknowledge what man is trying to do. The Tigris, on the other hand, is fast. It is difficult to navigate. It is only really recently, with the advent of steamships, and then this comes into effect about maybe 150, 200 years ago. Not very long in the scope of human existence. Very long in a single individual's life, but not very long in human existence. Did it become possible for us to navigate, to sail up the Tigris? It's a very swift and difficult river. Now the rivers break up the landscape and will proceed to be very unpredictable. And their uncertain nature is dependent on the fact that they're snow-fed rivers. They're fed by the snowfall in Armenia, which makes them both subject to violent, unpredictable flooding. Now, excuse me, once Mesopotamian civilization will come to depend very heavily on is really the management and the exploitation of these river valleys. By 3500 BCE, the landscape of Sumer was acquiring its current appearance of regulated fields, crisscrossed with canals and dikes. These long technological developments produced the first true cities of Sumer, and we can effectively date the end of the Ubaid period and the beginning of the Uruk period. That's simply the beginning of the time in which Uruk incorporates itself into a true city, into a city. Uruk does this because the tools are so sophisticated and the agriculture so productive that peoples can really abandon the smaller villages and move to the main city. They can stop living in these rural villages and they can come and live in the city of Uruk, and they can be dependent. They can be supported by those remaining rural villages. The agriculture is so productive that you don't need everybody doing that. You can sort of give new roles to the people living in the surrounding area. These early cities, they have farmlands of a radius of about 20 miles surrounding them, with outlying villages a bit further out. The first cities were able to house between, let's say, 10 and 20,000 people. Uruk by 29 BCE, by 2900 BCE, was a very large city with an impressive temple complex to Inanna or Ishtar, the patron goddess of the city, enclosed gardens and fields. At this point, the early cities in Sumer far outpaced the achievements of the Neolithic villages. There really was no comparison between them. These new cities in Sumer will now they will now find themselves being sustained by agriculture and long distance trade, trade which will eventually lead to writing and literate societies. Now, these developments, these remarkable developments in Mesopotamia, had to go hand in hand with developments in the Nile and the River Valley. We can all sort of look at them broadly together. Now, as stated earlier, agriculture and urban settlements were developed later in Egypt, and this occurred for a number of reasons. At this time in Northeast Africa, the area was still quite wet. That is the intense desertification, or the arid nature of Northeast Africa that we know now wasn't in effect. What was in effect was that the Nile River Valley was really unfarmable. Has the great river system of West Africa, the Niger. Really, all of North Africa was the river valleys, the great river systems of North Africa were unfarmable. There were other areas, the areas that we now know as the desert. They were really farmable. The northern Africa, what we now think of had the Great North Africa Desert. It was really savanna, grassland, crisscrossed with rivers and streams. Really, really well suited for easy, simple hunting and gathering. There was a lot of animal herds there, a lot of plant life there. There simply wasn't a need to devote themselves to the time and the effort, the intense time and intense effort to farming and animal raising. It was well-watered plains and ample savanna grasslands. This would change had the desert began to creep in. This pushed the river systems. Had the area became more arid, had the desert crept in, had it began to dry up. This sort of pushed the river systems of East and West Africa, the Niger and the Nile, into their current forms. It transformed the Nile River Valley from a dense, swamp-like, overvegetated marshland, more suited for people who simply fished and hunted aquatic fowl and gathered the wild grains. It pushed them to develop farming, but this only happens later. This explains why farming developed later in the Nile River Valley. The environment was not conducive to farming. And the best example I can really give, or comparison regarding the Nile at the time, is to think of the Sud region. That is the region in the far south of the modern South Sudan. The Sud to this day remains dense and very difficult to navigate. It's simply large pools of fresh water that is overly vegetated. And that's basically the Nile River Valley, the entirety of the Nile River Valley during the time that Sumer and during the Ubaid and the Uruk periods of Mesopotamia of the Near East. Now, around 5000 BCE, the Nile begins to dry up and begins to look like what we know and what we love. The Nile is the easiest of the ancient rivers to manage. The Nile is predictable. It floods at regular intervals and at the right time. When it floods, it brings with it rich volcanic topsoil from the Ethiopian highlands. And this is deposited on the floor of the Nile, along with vegetation that would get swept along with the rushing waters. This pattern would act to fertilize the Nile River Valley, allowing the farmers of the Nile River Valley to really just sort of reel in rich, bountiful harvest every year. The Nile is also easier to cope with because during inundation, the period where the river overflows her banks, the inhabitants would simply move up and away from the river and wait for the flood waters to recede before heading back down and to begin planting their crops. The Nile River Valley will be regarded as the most fertile of the lands in the ancient world. They're both known as the two states that will arise, the two primary states or regions that will arise will be known as Kemet and Tasseti. Those are the names of ancient Egypt and ancient Nubia, the land of the blacks or the Black Earth, and the land of the bowmen. Um, the Nile is brought under intensive cultivation and productive, and is increasingly regulated. During a good year, farmers can reel in or can yield up to 3 harvests in a single planting season in a single crop year. This is attested to by numerous ancient authors throughout antiquity. Egypt is the marvel of the world. They cannot believe that such bounty is just there. And it really stands in marked contrast to an area like the plains of Latium, the region surrounding Rome, which is regarded as the poorest uh, agricultural region in all of Italy during antiquity. Now, the origins of animal and crops, of the animals and the crops needed to sustain the low density urban and farming populations in the Nile is still a controversial subject. There are some who state that the animals and plant life were brought in from people fleeing the desertification of North Africa, and others saying that these crops were brought in from Mesopotamia, and others attest to it simply being of it simply arising once the area took its current form. So there's a lot of different arguments regarding that in Egypt. Now, with the drying up of the Nile River, there was an explosion, a very real explosion in the Neolithic age villages in the Nile. The villages show complicated and advanced cultural signs, but we do not see the development of Sumerian-style cities in the Nile River Valley. Egypt, or Kemet, would remain in a very sophisticated village culture, and Tasseti, or Nubia, will begin to develop cities. Now, this period would last from around 3500 to 3100 BCE. What will change, what will fuel the rise of civilizations and states in the Nile River Valley will be the unification of ancient Egypt under her first king, Narmer. Narmer, whose name means angry catfish, ruled as the king of Upper Egypt. And Upper Egypt is the portion of Egypt that is furthest inland, furthest into Africa, bordering Nubia at the Nile cataracts. And the cataracts are simply a series of boulders or rapids in the Nile, where the Nile sort of fish hooks. It makes this sort of loop, and there are all these rapids, these boulders in the Nile that make sailing down the Nile really difficult. At this point, once Narmer embarks on his stunning campaign that unites Upper and Lower Egypt, creating the Kingdom of Egypt, the Old Kingdom, he creates this polity that stretches for some 700 miles along the Nile River Valley. And at this point, Egypt simply leaps heads and shoulders above all of her neighbors, from a collection of Neolithic villages to a colossus kingdom whose achievements we will address at a later date. And in closing, I just like to touch on the Indus Valley civilization. Now, the Indus River exhibits a similar pattern of moving towards true cities at a later date, beginning about 2600, 2500 BCE. We do not know much about these people. Their sites were only rediscovered in the 1920s. They were discovered because the British were constructing their great Indian Railway, and the locals that they hired began to pillage the glaze-fired brick buildings for the rail beds from these sites. We do not know the original names of these towns, of these cities. We cannot read their writing, and chances are very slim that we will be able to read their writing. We think that this civilization is known in Sumerian records as Meluhha, a distant eastern and linked to the region of Sumer by trade. This civilization shows many of the characteristics that we have seen elsewhere. Beginning around 6000 BCE, they began to form Neolithic villages with the same basic crops and animals in the hills of Baluchistan, where the soil is easily workable. By 2600 to 2500 BCE, the population shifts to the lower Indus River Valley, we have two major sites named after their modern cities in Pakistan. They are Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. And both sites, the cities are at both sites. The cities are simply just highly impressive. They are clearly complicated cities with canals and dikes and agriculture, and they are also commercial cities linked to the West, linked to Mesopotamia by trade. One of the first great crops domesticated by the people was cotton, and from Akkadian records, they tell us that cotton is one of the products they most prize. And we know that cotton was produced here at these Indus River Valley sites. There are very strong trade connections between the two regions, and very increasingly trade ports along the Persian Gulf are formed, are settled, are developed. We are not sure what exactly happened to them. We're not sure why they declined, but we do know that starting around 1700 BCE, these cities will be abandoned, and the region will not see new cities emerge until around 1000 BCE. When cities do emerge, when they do re-emerge, the nexus of Indian civilization, the point of focus for Indian civilization, will shift from the Indus River to the Ganges River. Now, this shift for urban rebirth is associated with the Indo-Aryans, who are the speakers of the languages that give rise to Sanskrit and the other languages of India. Now these are nearly forgotten in the Hindu tradition, but they appear to be the progenitors of the material culture of future and subsequent Indian civilizations. And from here, we return to the cities of Mesopotamia, and we will revisit the great river systems of the Nile River Valley and the Indus River Valley and the Ganges River Valley at a later date. As always, I am Ted. Hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about this lecture, and I will see you guys next time for another lecture.